Section 2 of Lukundoo and Other Stories by Edward Lucas White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Floki's Blade. 1. Thorkel Villigerdsson was not only reputed the handsomest youth in all Norway, but was famous as a redoubtable champion who had unfailingly killed his man in every combat, and who was so skillful with weapons that he had never been seriously wounded in any of the countless affrays in which he had taken part. Therefore, although every one of the 39 other men on the Sea Raven hated him venomously, not one challenged him, or provoked him, or affronted him in any way, but all were most scrupulously civil. They all hated him, the three chieftains, Halfdan Ingolfsson, Kolgrim Erlendsson, and Lodbrok Islifsson, who owned the ship and had planned the adventure, hated him because, to their incredulous amazement, they found themselves indubitably afraid of him. Their 6 thralls, Vifil, Ulf, Hundi, Kep, Sokov, and Erp, hated him even more than they hated their own masters, for his air of ineffable superiority. The 26 other Vikings hated him because they felt themselves his inferiors, and were unwilling to acknowledge it, even in their thoughts. Most of all, his 4 perfidious sham friends, Hrudmar, Fingerdsson, Sigurd Otlitsson, Gelir Kolskegsson, and Bodvar Egilsson, who had hatched the plot to lure him to his doom and put him out of the way, and had enticed him to join the expedition, hated him for his beauty, his grace, his jaunty demeanor, and his vivacious wit. Attack him they dared not, and sulking inwardly they bided their time, outwardly suave and smiling, but with furtive winks at each other. Their opportunity came after a storm which drove them, they knew not where or whither, for in those times stars were the mariners' only guides. Throughout 3 nights and 3 days they saw neither star nor sun, in fact could barely see 2 ships' lengths through the driving scud and sluicing rain. In all that time they dared not set so much as a rag of sail, but taking turns, every man of them, thralls, warriors, and chieftains alike, with but brief snatches of uneasy sleep, labored mightily at the oars to keep the ship head to gale, or bailed furiously to keep her afloat. So terrific was the tempest that Kolgrim, their acknowledged leader, was unwilling to relinquish the helm and clung to it until exhaustion compelled him to rest. Even when he signaled for relief, neither Halfdan nor Lodbrok showed any alacrity for undertaking his momentous task. As they hesitated, although only for an instant, Thorkel seized the tiller just as Kolgrim's grasp loosened. So well did he steer, so completely did he justify his reputation as a seaman, that thereafter it was rather Kolgrim who acted as relief to him than he to Kolgrim. Every man of them all, Kolgrim included, felt safer with Thorkel at the helm. An hour or 2 before sunset of the long northern day, the storm blew itself out, the sky cleared, and the wind slackened and shifted to a fair breeze. They stepped their mast, hoisted their yard, set a full sail, and Halfdan at the tiller, and Lodbrok on lookout at the prow. The rest feasted. Champing and munching unhurriedly, they dispatched a vast quantity of food, washed down with copious draughts of mead. When no one could swallow another mouthful, Sigurd took the helm and Bodvar the lookout's place, and while Halfdan and Lodbrok ate, the rest disposed themselves to sleep, most of them to larboard, on the spare oars and coils of rope under the rowing benches. During the brief northern night, Sigurd and Bodvar set the Sea Raven on a true course by a whole skyful of brilliant constellations, but before dawn they saw the stars hidden all round the horizon, and gradually higher up, until only a few showed blurredly directly overhead, so that when the sleepers waked they found themselves enveloped in a dense fog, and soon after dawn the wind slackened until they had to man the oars to keep headway on the ship. The weary thralls and Kolgrim roused last. After Kolgrim waked, Thorkel was the only sleeper, and he slept heavily, exhausted by his overexertion at the tiller. Eyeing him as he lay on a coil of rope, Hrudmar and Gelir beckoned Sigurd and Bodvar. They resigned their posts to willing reliefs and picked their way amid-ship over and among the resting men and toiling rowers. Kolgrim, Lodbrok, and Halfdan joined them, and the seven conferred. All conned Thorkel, and all agreed that he was fast asleep and far from rousing. Then the three chieftains beckoned their 6 thralls and instructed them. Erp and Ulf took convenient lengths of ratline and knotted in each a clean-running noose. Vifil paired with Hundi, and Sukulf with Kep, each pairing choosing a length of light rope, thicker than a big man's thumb. Cautiously the 6 crawled towards Thorkel, every man aboard, except a few sleepers and such oarsmen as were abaft of Thorkel's position, watching their approach with malicious relish. Hundi and Vifil slipped their rope under Thorkel's knees. Kep and Sokolf took a turn with theirs round his ankles. Ulf and Erp each noosed a wrist. When all 6 were ready, they looked towards Kulgrim, and at his nod the 2 nooses tightened, and the ropes were knotted fast round Thorkel's knees and ankles. Even that did not waken him, and as Erp and Ulf pulled their cords and dragged his arms wide, his 4 pretended friends sprang on him, turned him on his face, and, after a violent struggle, for even with knees and ankles lashed, Thorkel fought like a wildcat. They pinioned his arms behind him and turned him once more face upward, trussed and helpless. Then they gloated over him, told him what they really thought of him, and insulted him to their heart's content. Halfdan, who was an acclaimed skald, composed and chanted over him an impromptu drapa of triumph. Even the thralls expressed their envious malignity. Gillir proposed to run him through, and Bodvar to throw him overboard, but Kolgrim demurred. The 34 freemen had taken oath to a pledge of mutual fellowship, as was customary in all Viking voyages, and he pointed out that they were bound, all of them, by their oath, and must keep its letter, if not its spirit. Lodbrok therefore suggested that they set him adrift, bound as he was in their smallest boat, which had been half-stove during the storm and was presumably leaky, putting into it with him a small hide flask of water and 1 smoked fish. Then they could accuse him of willful desertion. By then it was nearer noon than sunrise, but no sight of the sun had they had, nor could any man in that fog conjecture the sun's place in the sky. Their outlook was all grey mist and smooth ground swell, for there was not a cat's paw of breeze. From the boat they took its sail, mast, and oars, but they did not search it carefully. In it they laid a leather flask of water and 2 little smoked fish. In it they laid Thorkel, trussed as he was, but as they launched the boat, Kulgrim cut the ropes at his knees and ankles. As boat and ship drifted apart, his enemies mocked him, their grinning faces peering between and over the shields which lined the low rail.
"Hoist your sail!"
Bodvar jeered at him.
"And make for Norway or Iceland as you prefer. You are about as far from the one as from the other. You have no worse or better chance either way."
"Hope you relish your provender,"
Gillir called.
"You'll need both oars soon,"
Hrodmar shrilled.
"And I don't see either." "Don't you wish you had a bailer?"
Sigurd shouted. Soon he saw only fog. He eyed the dirty water sloshing about in the dory's bilge. The boat was not leaking rapidly, but it was leaking. No water had lapped over the gunwales, and the big ground swells were long and smooth. Of air there was not a breath. For the time being he had only the leaks to fear. And in the bow, jammed under the tiny forethwart and the triangular cubbyhole, he saw a small wooden scoop bailer. It meant more to him than the 2 little fish and the leather water bottle under the after thwart. He conned the edges of the gunwales and thwarts. He saw 2 sharp splinters. The larger and sharper was where he could not use it, but painfully and with great exertion he wriggled, hunched, and wrenched himself until he brought the cords which bound his wrists against the other splinter. With efforts distressing at once, and not long afterwards agonizing, he saw the rope against the splinter. Panting, a jelly of exhaustion, shivering and sweating, he all but fainted, but he found fresh energy every time he glanced at the bilge water. At last, just as hope and strength together were failing him, the cord parted. A few jerks and twists of his arms and hands, and they were free. He shook himself, beat his arms against his chest, and sprang upon the bailer. To his great satisfaction, it was not long before no deftness could scoop it up half full. The boat was not leaking too fast for him. As the dense fog and breathless calm continued to brood over the waters and the slow groundswell even abated, his cockleshell kept afloat, not only all that day and night, but throughout the 2 following days and nights. But the 3rd night after he had been set adrift found him near exhaustion. More than half his time was occupied in bailing, and his muscles ached. He was afraid to sleep for fear of foundering before he woke. Once, in spite of himself, he fell deeply asleep, and roused to find the gunwales almost awash, so that the most desperate fury of bailing barely sufficed to save him. In the flurry of effort, his remaining fish went overboard in a scoopful of water, unheeded. His flask he had emptied by dusk of the 2nd day, control himself all he could. As the slow dawn whitened the fog after the short Arctic night, he thought he was delirious, for he seemed to hear the roar of surf on rocks and not far off. Then suddenly, all at once, the fog thinned, sun rays lanced the last wisps of it, the air cleared. He saw the sun plain, saw the sky cloudless, saw the horizon all round, and beheld, close to him and opposite the just-risen sun, a rocky coast. Instantly he realized that his enemies had been vastly in error as to the position of the Sea Raven, and had set him adrift only a few leagues east of Iceland. In spite of his buzzing head, his parched mouth, his shivering and trembling limbs, his general faintness, he felt new vigor infused all through him. With his pitiful beechen scoop, he alternately bailed and paddled. The current, he felt, was drawing him towards the cliffs. He saw a headland close. With his bailer he strove to guide the skiff towards it. The currents were kind, and towards that headland he drifted. He saw no beach, but many flat-topped rocks just awash, some hardly wet by the lazy surges. Between them and him he saw no broken water. If his boat dashed into or scraped against a rock, he might leap to it without a ducking. Actually, he had the luck to achieve just that, and saw his boat, stove and smashed after, he had firm footing on almost dry basalt. He stood in his doublet, hose, and brogues, with only his inner girdle, without belt, mantle, sword, dagger, or even belt-knife. Everything on him was damp from the fog and the splashing of his long bailing, but though his teeth chattered in the chilly morning air, doubly chilly to him after the milder temperature out at sea, he was not the half-frozen waif he would have been if he had had to swim ashore. To his left, to southwards, the cliffs seemed beaten by the surf. Before him, to westwards, he thought he espied a bit of beach not far ahead. To his right, northwards, he seemed to descry a headland afar across a fjord. He walked westwards, swaying, tottering, stumbling, even staggering, but keeping his feet. Gulls and other seafowl wheeled and screamed above and about him. Not 100 paces from his landing place he came upon a little rill trickling down a nook in the cliff. He knelt and scooped up a handful of icy water. Then he lay beside the rivulet and counted a slow 100 between each handful of the water and the next. Before his thirst was entirely quenched, he stood up. Then he scanned the rocks for birds' nests. He saw many, but of the scores of eggs he broke, but one was eatable. This he sipped and slowly swallowed its contents. He felt new life all over him. Not stumbling now, he stepped heedfully forward. He felt strangely large and light, and whatever he gazed at looked dim and vague. But he felt really able to walk. He rounded a jutting elbow of the cliff. Before him, irradiated by the slant sun rays, he saw 3 handsome young noblewomen, walking arm in arm. All were bareheaded, each with a forehead ribbon round her flowing hair. The middlemost was tall, full-contoured, with very black locks. She was enveloped in a crimson mantle. The girl on her right was of medium height, slender, with glossy brown tresses, and wore a mantle of dark blue. The third was small and very lovely, her hair golden, her cheeks pink, her eyes blue, all set off by a mantle of bright grass-green. Thurkel thought them Norns come to escort him to Valhalla. A cloud, gray and then inky black, swept between him and his outlook. He felt himself topple. 2. When Thurkel came to himself, he was in bed in the pitch dark. He felt about him and found that he was in a sort of bunk, a wall on his right hand, and on his left a polished board. He ran his hand along its upper edge. He was rather deep down in his berth, and under him was an infinity of yielding featherbed. He was well covered with warm quilts. He tried to stretch, but the space was too short for him. He composed himself and slept again. When he woke the second time, it was daylight, and he saw by his bunk a tall, spare, elderly noblewoman, severe-looking, hatchet-faced, with a lean and stringy neck and gray hair. She was clad in garments of undyed wool of the usual rusty brown. "Son," she warned him, "you must not try to speak. Drink this slowly." And as he weakly tried to raise himself in the wall bed, she supported him with her right arm, at the same time holding to his lips with her left hand a silver goblet. Thurkel tasted a delicious posset, compounded of milk, mead, honey, barley meal, and of other ingredients unknown to him. He swallowed most of it, fell back among his down pillows, and slept again at once. His third waking was again in full daylight. He felt more like himself. He saw that his bed occupied most of one side of a fair-sized room, wainscoted in dark wood and with a low ceiling, similarly paneled. Opposite his bunk stood a high, narrow table. In the wall by the foot of his bunk was a low doorway, its door shut. In the opposite wall was a window, whose contracted casements had small panes of fish-gut membrane, stretched across wood lattices. The panes were bright, with the glare of brilliant sunshine full on them, and much light filtered through, so that the room was well lighted. By his bed, facing the window, in one of the two chairs, sat a tall, magnificently dignified elderly man, gray-haired, ruddy of complexion, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a reddish-brown mantle of fine wool. He wore a gold neck-chain from which hung a large, flat, oval gold amulet case.
"Son," he said, "you must not attempt to speak. Hearken and remember. You are housed at Hofstadr on Revdorfjord, by Faskrudnes, on the east coast of Iceland. I, Thorstein Vilgerdsson, am master of Hofstadr. We know nothing of you except that my daughter and my two nieces found you early in the morning, day before yesterday, on the strand by Faskrudnes. My wife has been caring for you, and she now tells me that you will soon be able to be up and about. Only after you are well and strong will I permit you to tell your story. Meanwhile you are our guest. Do as I bid you. Be silent. Compose your mind. Repose yourself, and help my wife to restore you to strength and vigor. When you are yourself, we shall talk again. Now sleep."
Thorkel was compliantly mute, and his host rose and left him. 2 mornings later, Thorkel woke to find Thorstein again seated by his bed. Then he saw, on the table opposite his bed, a tray with a goblet and a hunch of bread on it.
"Son," the old man queried, "are you entirely awake?"
After Thorkel's affirmation, Thorstein said,
"My wife judges that you are now sufficiently recovered to tell your story, but you had best first fortify yourself with some food."
And he himself rose and fetched the tray from the table. Thorkel acquiesced and swallowed a few mouthfuls. Then he settled himself back on his pillows, his host resumed his armchair, and Thorkel began his story by naming himself.
"Of Vilgerdsson," the old man exclaimed, "and from Rogaland. We must be cousins, however distant. In my long life I have never known or heard of any Norwegian Vilgerdsons. As far as my knowledge goes, our family has long been wholly Icelandic. We are descended from Floki Vilgerdsson of Rogaland, the first voyager who ever wintered in Iceland. 136 years ago he sailed past the headlands of Faxaflói and wintered in the Breiðafjörð. But he and his associates were so carried away by the abundance of fish and the ease of catching them that they neglected to cure enough hay, and their livestock all perished. Therefore he sailed home next spring. But 20 and more years later, when past middle age, after most of the west and north of Iceland had already been settled, Floki returned and chose a home here in the east, on this very spot. I am his great-great-great-grandson, and heir to him and all his."
"I," said Thorkel, "am great-great-great-grandson to Snorri Vilgerdsson, young brother to Floki the Viking and settler. For both were sons of Vilgerd Vilgerdsson of Rogaland."
"Then," said his host, You are a fourth cousin to my children, and they are your fourth cousins. You are one of us. And now tell me your story."
When Thurkel had said his say, and had answered all his host's questions, the old man said,
"My wife opines that it will now benefit you to be out of bed and in the open air. My younger sons, Thurgils and Thurbrand, will help you to dress, and will assist you to walk about, for, although you may resent the suggestion, you are not yet strong enough for it to be well for you to attempt walking unassisted."
And he called his sons, handsome youths, who clasped hands with Thorkel, called him cousin after their father's explanation, and when the old man had gone out, assisted him to rise. He found he needed assistance. They helped him to don a shirt of the finest linen, knitted hose of soft wool, noblemen's shoes, a doublet of the best woolen cloth, and a fine crimson mantle of wool, delightful to feel and handle. They girded him with an outer belt, but there was no sign of sword-belt, sword, poniard, or knife. Each of them wore a belt-knife with a staghorn heft, and a dagger and sword with steel guards and hilts of walrus ivory, pommeled with gold. One on each side of him, they supported him as he strove to stand, and they guided him through the doorway into a spacious, plank-floored, high-raftered hall, lighted by many small windows placed high up in the tall gable ends. Low, narrow doors were all down both sides, with an ample fireplace and a big chimney-piece midway of one side. At one end was the main doorway, at the other a door almost as large. His helpers conducted him out through the main doorway into a bench in the sunlight where they seated him. Thurbrand sat by him. Thurgils walked away. Thurkel found the cool, soft breeze invigorating and yet mild, for it was near midsummer and as genial as it ever is in Iceland. The slant sun-rays warmed him. He basked and gazed about him. He saw close by a strongly built storehouse of stone and great ash beams, high-gabled, though its roof was not as steep and tall as that of the mansion. Further away he made out a big sheepfold, with sheds, a large cattle-byre, an ample stable, and 2 very large barns. In whatever direction he looked, the extensive level space in which the buildings were grouped was bounded by a stone wall, breast-high, and not of boulders but of roughly squared blocks. Some 200 yards or more distant, topping a low hill, was a temple, for with its great size, its high and steep roof, its scalloped shingles, its horsehead and fishtail ornaments at the ridge-pole ends and eave ends, its carven gable ends, it could be nothing else. Some of the thralls were busy about the buildings, and several maidservants passed in and out. Thurkel saw no men-at-arms, nor any of the family except the 2 brothers. Thorbrand sat smiling, but mute. Thurkel kept mute and basked. After a time Thurgils came back, and Thorbrand strolled away. When Thorbrand returned, he said, "Mother thinks that you were best back in your bed." Thurkel acquiesced and suffered himself to be escorted indoors. In bed he ate some food brought by a tow-headed serving-maid. Soon he slept. He woke near dusk of the long northern day and again ate what the same maid brought him, and was again soon asleep. Next morning Thorstein was again sitting by him when he awoke. As before, he inquired how he felt, and himself served him with food and drink. When he had reset the tray on the table and reseated himself, he said, "Young man, I and my family have talked over you and your story. I and my daughter and my nieces believe you, but all 5 of my sons, my 2 daughters-in-law, my accountant, my seneschal, my skald, and every one of my men-at-arms are convinced that you are not a castaway from any ship, though likely enough a Norwegian and no Icelander. They are unanimously of the opinion that you are a spy craftily insinuated into our community by our enemies. They point out that your clothing was dry when you were carried in here, that neither it nor your hair showed any signs of your having been swimming, that such a marvel as your having leaped ashore from a ship's boat, drifting without sail, oars, or rudder, is too improbable for them to believe it other than a clumsy invention. They all insist that I would imperil myself and all my household if I were to accept your story and keep you here as a guest. My word is law here, but I feel that it would be unwise for me to disregard so unanimous, so insistent, and so clamorous a dissent from my views."
Now, young man, if you have in fact been sent here by the Mioviverders or the Sadisverders, you had best admit it at once, and make a clean breast of the whole matter. You shall not be harmed in any way. I will have you fed and cared for until you are fit for a short journey, and then I will equip you with flint and steel, a belt knife, a dagger, a sword and sword belt, a horseman's cloak, a good horse, well bitted, saddled, and girthed, and a supply of food. And I will send a thrall to guide you round the head of Revdar Fjord, and to speed you on your way. But if you are what you assert you are, and claim our protection and hospitality as the dues of a castaway, you must convince all my household of the truth of your tale. I am Thorkel Vilgerdsson of Rogaland in Norway, he replied. I know nothing of any Mjorviverders or Sadisverders, or of any foes of yours. I never set foot on Iceland until I leapt ashore from my drifting boat, soon after sunrise of the morning on which I encountered your daughter and nieces. I have never, in Iceland, set eyes on any Icelanders except members of your household. What I have told you is true in every particular, but how may I convince you of its truth? As you must know from my name and my sons' names, Thorstein answered, we are steadfast adherents of the old faith. Those who suspect you, and my wife, the most embittered of those against you in particular, would be at once convinced if you take formal oath to the truth of your statements, an oath sworn upon your own blood and the sacred ring of our holy temple, called Thor and Odin, to witness. If you are willing to take oath as I suggested, no one here will any longer doubt you. I am entirely willing, Thorkel declared. I am more than willing, I am eager. The suspicions of your household are natural. If you have crafty enemies near at hand and live under threat of being raided, I will swear as you suggest. I infer, said Thorstein, that you also, then, like all here at Hofstadr, are a firm believer in the gods of our fathers. I am indeed, Thorkel affirmed. Have you met Christians? His host queried. Too many, said Thorkel. Too many by far. Have you talked with any about their beliefs? The old man inquired. With many, Thorkel said. And what do you think of them? Thorstein pressed him. It seems to me, said Thorkel, that they claim to have a system of sorcery and magic far more efficacious and far cheaper than ours. That is about all I can gather from their talk. Their religion costs far less than ours because they hold that no blood sacrifices are necessary, stating that one man hundreds of years ago achieved one sacrifice by which all men may benefit forever, no other being required after that one. How could this be, or can be, I cannot conceive. But such appears to be their view. Then they seem to think that priests can be largely dispensed with. Certainly they have far fewer than we, and their priests are cheaper to maintain than ours, as they require less in the way of ornaments, raiment, food, and servants. Then, though no one of them has conveyed to me what they mean, they all allege that their invocations win surer and more effective responses than those which we receive from our deities. That is all I can make out about their novelties. Your impressions, Thorstein said, tally with mine. Christians are utterly incomprehensible to me. In particular, they all rant about peace on earth and goodwill to men. Yet since they became Christians, the Mjolnirverders and the Sadisverders are just as implacably hostile to us here as before. My father repeatedly made overtures to them proposing conferences to negotiate for reconciliation, for mutual concessions, for laying our differences and the damage done to each side before the Althing, for reference to the courts, and for a decision and settlement, for a termination of the feud and the establishment of harmony and amity. I have made similar proffers, but they have been inexorably hostile. In fact, since they became Christians, they seem, if possible, even more ferocious, rancorous, and bloodthirsty than before. That, said Thorkel, is just about the attitude towards us, heathen, of all the Christians I have ever met or heard of. Their idea of peace is unqualified submission, or total extermination for us, and complete triumph, and unquestioned domination for themselves.
Not one will listen to proposals of compromise, accommodation, or mutual forbearance. They seem to me opinionated, bigoted, fanatical, overbearing, and arrogant. We must fight or perish. There appears to be no other way."
"You speak sensibly, my son, it seems to me," the old man said. "You have convinced me that you are sincere. Your oath in the temple will convince all my household and all my retainers."
Then he rose and went out. 3. Again Thorgils and Thorbrand entered the bedroom and helped Thorkild to dress. This time he needed little assistance, and this time they girt him with a sword belt and equipped him with a handy belt knife, a fine dagger, and a sword in a decorated scabbard. Out they escorted him, Thorkel now walking easily and unaided. In the open he found awaiting him Thorstein, his 3 elder sons, Thorfinn, Thorgir, and Thord, a handsome and very blond young giant who was presented to him as
Finnvard Sigurdsson of Faskurdsfjord, my future son-in-law.
Thorstein's house skald, Olmud Burkson, and his seneschal, Ari Gormson. There was a score of men-at-arms lounging about. After the presentations they set off towards the temple, Thorstein linking arms with Thorkel and leading the way. "I myself," he said, "am Gothi of this temple, which my grandfather, Thorleif Vilgerdsson, built with timber fetched from Norway." The temple, Thorkel judged, was a full 100 feet long. Temple fashion, the end under the gable which they approached was doorless. The side wall had 2 ample doorways, each near an end. They passed in by that nearest them towards the right end of the side wall, and turned to their left. In behind them straggled the men-at-arms, who had trooped after them. Thorkel could feel the reverential awe with which the great, hulking, burly, truculent spearmen entered the holy place. Midway of the opposite long wall they passed the high seat, between the tall pillars, each with its 3 consecrated bolts of gilded bronze. They were visible even in the dim light afforded by the small latticed windows, gut-paned, high up in the gable ends. Towards the end of the temple they entered the oval, defined by a ring of thin slabs of stone set on edge. Inside the oval, near the end of it towards the further gable of the building, was an altar of the customary form, a great thick slab of dressed stone, full 3 ells square, supported by 4 stone posts, squared, carved with runes, and set deep in the beaten earth floor. The slab of the altar was also carved with runes. On it lay the ground holy ring of solid silver, weighing full 30 pounds. Thorstein lifted the great ring and slid it up his right arm to the shoulder. There Thorfinn tied it with a crimson wool ribbon, slipped under his father's left armpit, and crossed on his left shoulder, so that the ring would not slide down the arm. Then, standing on Thorstein's right, Thorkel unsheathed his dagger, and with its point lightly slashed the back of his left hand, tilting it till the dagger blade ran with blood. Then, placing his left hand on the temple ring, and holding the dagger point down over the center of the altar, he swore, "As my blood drips upon this altar from the point of this dirk, so may my blood, and the heart's blood of all my kin, of any wife I may wed, of any children I may have, of all those dear to me, be spilt upon the earth, if my oath is not truthful. I swear by my own blood, by the holy ring which I grasp, by this altar, by the pillars of the high seat, by their sacred bolts, before Thor and Odin, that I am Thorkel Vilgerdsson of Rogaland in Norway, and that I am newly cast away on the coast of Iceland, and have never, in Iceland, seen or spoken with any Icelander, except dwellers here at Hofstadr. If my oath is false, may my heart's blood and the blood of all those dear to me be spilt upon the earth, as my blood now drips from this point of my dirk. Before Odin and Thor I have sworn." Thereafter Thorfinn removed the Gothi's ring from his father's arm, and he and Thorstein laid it in its place midway of the altar slab. Outside the temple, Thorgils dressed the slash on the back of Thorkel's left hand. Then Thorstein first, and after him his sons in the order of their ages, clasped hands with Thorkel, each uttering the formula, "You are our dear and trusted cousin." Finnvard followed, then Ari, Olmud, and the men-at-arms saluting Thorkel, crying, "We are brothers in arms." From the temple and Thorstein led Thorkel into the storehouse, and into that part of it which was used as an armory.
"Look over these weapons," he said, "and select a sword, poniard, and belt knife to your mind. Try first those you now have. If they suit you, keep them, but be sure that the balance of the sword is precisely what you prefer, and that you are armed as you desire."
Outside in the mild sunshine of a day unusually mellow for Iceland, they sat on the benches flanking the doorway and chatted until after midday. Then Thorstein cautioned Thorkel that a man who had been exposed and exhausted as he had best lie down an hour or so before his first heavy meal after his privations. When Thorgils wakened and summoned him, he found in the great hall a numerous assemblage. He was presented by Thorstein to Thorkatla, his wife, to his daughter Thorgerd, and his two nieces, Thorarna and Thordis, whom he had encountered on the beach. Thorarna was the tall, full-contoured, black-tressed beauty, and Thordis the exquisite blonde, whom he had thought the most beautiful of the three. Thorfinn's wife, Arnora, and Thord's wife, Valdis, were personable young women. Thorstein occupied the high seat, facing the fireplace. To the left and right of him sat his family, on benches ranged along that side of the hall, but far enough from the wall to leave space for anyone to walk behind them, and to pass in or out of any door. On the opposite side of the hall, flanking the chimney-piece, was a similar row of benches, occupied by the men-at-arms, more than 40 together. Towards the ends of the hall sat such dependents and thralls as were not busy serving the feast. The servitors carried in more than 80 light, collapsible tables, each in 3 parts, a square top and 2 trestles. One was placed before each diner. The fare was varied and abundant, but notably characteristic of Iceland. There were unlimited supplies of fresh whey in jars, pitchers and bowls of curd, platters heaped with slices of cheese, both new and aged. There was even an overabundance of smoked and fresh fish, cooked in every known manner, plenty of tender fat mutton, beef, and veal, and each borne in by 2 brawny thralls, 2 great platters, one piled with convenient cuts of stewed horseflesh, the other with similar collops of horseflesh roasted. There was a moderate supply of manchettes of excellent rye, barley, and wheaten bread, handed along in smallish flat osier baskets or on similar trays. Maids continually passed and repassed, proffering basins of warm water and towels, for in those days forks were unknown, and besides plates and spoons of beechwood from Norway and belt knives, fingers were the only table implements, and frequent washing of the hands was necessary for comfort. Thorgils and Thorbrand, between whom Thorkel sat, plied him with offerings of every viand brought in, and saw that his goblet was kept full of well-aged, fragrant mead. Even more than the large household and lavish fare, Thorkel was impressed by the chimney-piece, which faced him on his left, and by its fireplace, not aglow with smouldering peat, but ablaze with a generous heap of crackling driftwood. He commented on this to Thorbrand. "I have never seen any other chimney or fireplace except ours," was his reply. "It is said that 2 halls in the river valleys about Faxafloy have chimney fireplaces, and that there is another in a mansion on Bredafjord, but none of us have seen any. My great-grandfather had this built of native stone, for there is much fire-resisting rock on our island." "This," Thorkel said, "is the only chimney fireplace I have myself ever seen. My home, like every other hall I have ever entered till now, has only a fireplace midway of its floor, so that the smoke blackens the rafters before it finds the hole in the roof." After the feast, Thorstein called for silence. "We have with us," he said, "what is almost as good as a visiting skald, a guest who has had marvelous adventures. All of us will now listen to Thorkel Vilgerdsson of Rogaland in Norway, if he will be so good as to accede to my request that he tell us of his dangers and of his escape." Thorkel blushed, but was encouraged by the smiling, eager faces turned towards him. He took courage, stood up, and told his tale, haltingly at first, later more fluently. After he had finished and sat down, Olmud twanged his harp and recited a drapa describing and praising the exploits of Floki Vilgerdsson, the Viking and settler. When he ceased, the company dispersed to bed. During the ensuing days, Thorkel became well acquainted with Hofstadr, its denizens and its neighborhood. As soon as he felt his full strength and vigor return, he spent his mornings with Thurger, Thorbrand, Thorgils, and Finnvord at fencing, target practice with spears or arrows, wrestling, and other such manly exercises. At all of these he excelled, yet his genial demeanor was so winsome that his easy victories gave no offense to his companions. They also went swimming together, and fishing, both in the many nearby streams, and offshore in a very handy small boat, heavily built, blunt-bowed, yet a good sailor. Thurkel was amazed at the number of fish, and at the rapidity with which they could be caught. A hook thrown in the water was taken almost at once. They rode about the neighborhood on fine mounts, for in those early days Icelandic horses were still fully equal to Norwegian horses, as the breed was kept up by constant importations of tall, strong, speedy, and spirited stallions. After not many days, Thurkel learned the country further afield, for he was invited to accompany Thorstein on a tour of inspection of his district, for he was not only Gotti, that is, priest of the temple at Hofstadr, but also Gotti, that is, magistrate of a district called a Gothorth, all Iceland being divided into Gothorths. Thorstein made his tour attended by his 5 sons, by several cousins, among whom were Thorlak Vilgerdsson of Thilmerk and Thorvald Vilgerdsson of Husvik, by many thingmen, dependents, and yeomen, and by a strong guard of well-horsed spearmen. Thurkel was much edified by Thorstein's promptness at settling controversies and redressing grievances. The old man displayed an uncanny intuition, and seemed to know all his vassals' thoughts, motives, wants, desires, and needs, without being told. After the tour was over, at a moment when Thorstein was at ease, Thurkel ventured to express his admiration. His host smiled.
"A chieftain," he said, "must possess the faculty of seeing into his vassals' hearts, and of knowing their thoughts without question asked and answer given, even without any uttered word. A man who cannot divine the unspoken thoughts of his dependents will not long retain the prestige vital for a Gothi, or for any sort of chieftainship. Necessarily I know much without being told, with hardly even a glance. Mostly, for instance, I can foresee months in advance, sometimes even years in advance, what girl each youth will woo for his wife, what maiden each lad desires, even what lad finds favor in each maiden's eyes. Such must any chieftain divine." At Hofstadr, Thorkel was soon at home among the buildings. Not less than by the chimney, inset fireplace, and lavish wood fire was he impressed by the fortifications of the homestead. It was protected all round with a dry moat. The earth from which, thrown up on the inner side, formed a considerable rampart, topped on all 4 sides of the enclosure by a solid wall of large, roughly squared blocks of stone. At the corners were jutting, bulging, circular bastions, well stockaded with birch logs, set deep in the earth, butt up and touching each other, every one fully 3 spans broad at the upturned butt, for in those days the primeval woods of Iceland furnished logs much larger than any now obtainable on the island. The stockades, like the walls, were breast-high. Thurkel had never seen a bastion before, nor heard of one, and was much impressed by the novelty, originality, and manifest adequacy of the device. The idea of a bastion, that it affords defenders of a fortification an opportunity of shooting sideways at an assailant crossing the fosse or scaling the parapet, appears so obvious to us that we can scarcely realize that there ever was a time when it was unknown. Yet hundreds, even thousands of years after it was common, in a matter of course, in the Mediterranean countries, it had not yet penetrated the ruder northern lands. In fact, in all parts of the world, men were not quick to conceive the idea, and as with other devices, very slow to adopt it from foemen. Almost as much was Thorkel impressed by the bathhouse, a small structure, one might say a hut, built of sod and stone with a low door, and only one very tiny window. Inside there was room for only one person, and a pail of water beside a very small stone stove. This was heated almost red-hot, and then the bather, with a dipper, poured on it water which at once filled the hut with steam, both cleansing and refreshing. On either side of the chimney-piece, in the great hall, was a sort of trophy of spears, shields, and swords, arranged in a pattern like a 6-pointed star,
6 short pikes crossed and lashed to pegs, 6 small round shields set between the radiating spears, and 12 swords, 2 by each shield. Above the fireplace was another, of 6 long swords, their points together, their hilts apart, with shields between. Thurkel, inquiring about these, was told that they had been placed there by Thorstein's grandfather, Thorleif Vilgerson, who had built the hall and temple. The spears and swords forming the 2 flanking trophies were fine and valued weapons of former Vilgersons. The trophy over the fireplace was formed of the very sword worn all his life by Floki Vilgerson, the Viking and settler, and of 5 cunningly exact replicas of it, made at Thorleif Vilgerson's command by Huskuld Vestarson, a famous smith.
"I do not myself know," said Thorstein, "which is Floki's blade. My father told me that he did not know. No one knows. No man has used any one of those 6 swords since before I was born. It is told that Floki's blade is enchanted, that no one except a Vilgerson could wield it, that to anyone not a Vilgerson it would be heavier than a thick bar of iron, but that in time of peril, to Floki's heirs or kin, it is magical to infuse into its wielder superhuman valor, swiftness, dexterity, and strength. It is also told of Floki's blade that it knows friend from foe, and will not smite a friend, no matter how frenziedly its wielder believes him a foe, nor yet will it fail to smite a treacherous foe, no matter how implicitly its wielder trusts the traitor. We have come to regard these swords as almost as holy as the bolts and the pillars by the high seat in our temple, as almost as sacred as the temple ring itself. Their presence in our hall we regard as a protection and safeguard to us all, as a sort of talisman for Hofstadr. We all, and all my men-at-arms and thingmen and retainers, reverence and treasure them." Thorkel could see that they were very handsome swords. He learned that Thorstein never had fewer than 60 men-at-arms on duty, but not all of them were ever at Hofstadr itself. Some were on watch along the cliffs, on the lookout for an attack from seaward. There were always 2 or more patrol boats on the offing conning the sea northwards. The lookouts on the cliffs also watched the fjord for signs of an attempt to attack in boats from its northern shore. And some men-at-arms were always scattered about at the farmsteads of Thorstein's thingmen, and other dependents, especially towards the head of Revdarfjord, round which must come any attack in force by land. Thorkatla he found kind-hearted, but taciturn, sharp-tongued when she did speak, and of a very stern, harsh, and austere disposition. Thurigerd, staid, astute, and shrewd, was yet by nature trustful, unsuspicious, confiding, artless, and unaffected. She gave Thurkel an experience entirely novel to him, for she displayed for him a warm sisterly interest, as to which she was entirely frank and open, while indubitably ardently in love with her handsome Finnvard. Thorarna and Thuridis he greatly admired and liked. He could not make out at first which he liked better. That both were manifestly deeply in love with him he took as a matter of course. He had long become habituated to having attractive maidens fall in love with him on short acquaintance and show it. The immemorial usages of Scandinavian life made it absolutely unthinkable, in the Iceland of those days, that a young man and a young woman should ever be alone together, even for a moment. But on the other hand, life in Iceland was so free, open, frank, spontaneous, unconventional, and inartificial, that not only were lads and lasses constantly encountering each other about the dwellings, but that not merely was chatting a matter of course and unremarked, but that such folk as Thurkel, Thorarna, and Thuridis might and did walk about together out of doors, and sit together side by side, conversing for hours in the hall, in full sight of those about them, unnoticed and left to themselves. In this way Thurkel became rapidly well acquainted with both his host's nieces, and heard from each her story. Stories very much alike, and of a kind far too common in Iceland at that period, and for centuries later. The envenomed and unremitting enmity between Revdarfjorders and their neighbors, the Mjolfurverders and Sedisverders, had resulted in recurrent reprisals. Thorarna was the only survivor of an overwhelmingly successful assault upon her father's homestead. Her father, Thorstein's brother, Thorleik, had been killed in the fighting. And when the buildings were set on fire by the victorious assailants,
All the family had perished in the flames, except Thorarna, who had a child of 3, had been saved by her faithful nurse. Thuridis, the only daughter of Thorstein's brother Thorgest, was the survivor of a similar massacre. Much of the evening leisure at Hofstadr was taken up with tales of such atrocities as these, and of like assaults on homesteads, some by one side, some by the other, some craftily planned, artfully delivered, and overwhelmingly successful, others resulting in drawn battles and leaving the homestead in mourning for some of its defenders, but unpillaged and unburnt. Yet others unplanned, impulsive, foolhardy, undermanned or bungled in delivery and resulting in the utter discomfiture of the assailants. Thurkel sat in silence and listened to many long tales of this kind from Olmod, the house-skald, from Thorstein himself, and from his elder sons. From them also he listened to even longer tales of complaints against one or the other side before the Althing at Thingvellir, nearly every year at the 2 weeks' summer meeting of this National Assembly. They told in great detail of the impassioned accusations of the plaintiffs, of the indignant rejoinders of the defendants, of the citations of the respondents before the High Court of Justice, of the evidence of the witnesses for each side, of the arguments of the lawmen, of the disagreements of the judges, of their occasional agreement, of their verdicts and judgments, and of the indemnities they assessed upon the convicted aggressors. In almost every case, Thurkel heard of the ignoring or flouting of the court's decision, and of yet further reprisals, duels, forays, and outrages. What astonished him most was that in all these tales of duels, murders, treacheries, ambushes, pillagings, outrages, butcheries, massacres, and arson, and of their consequences, the narrators talked as if the Althing were an efficient legislature, with power to see to it that its enactments be observed as the law of the island, as if the courts had the authority they assumed to have, and could enforce their judgments, verdicts, decrees, and penalties, as if, in truth, law and justice did exist in Iceland, whereas in fact it appeared from every tale he listened to, from every detail of every narrative, that their vaunted Althing was merely a turbulent yearly social gathering, accomplishing nothing except a waste of time and futile wrangling, making a vain show of counterfeiting a sham legislature, which empty pretense all Icelanders kept up with a curious mingling of unconscious self-deception and shamefaced effrontery, that the courts, while generally spoken of with respect, were in fact derided by all malefactors and unable to give effect to their decrees, judgments, and verdicts, to enforce their penalties, or to exact the indemnities they granted, so that they were on the whole a costly, time-wasting, exhausting, and pitiable farce. It was plain to Thurkel that the Icelanders, if his host and his household were fair examples, had somehow duped themselves into fancying that they had courts which dispensed justice, and a government which maintained law and order, whereas it was manifest that they lived in a condition of utter anarchy, where there was no protection for life or property except the fighting prowess of the men of a homestead as concerned themselves, their folk, and their possessions, or of the men-at-arms of a chieftain for him and his. It was plain that beautiful Thuridis, magnificent Thorarna, lovely Thorgerd, fair Arnora, dainty Validus, and stern Thorkatla were living in daily peril of a horrible death, and were safe only in so far as their men could protect them. Yet they, like their men, boasted of the noble freedom of life in Iceland, pitied the servile condition of Norwegians under their tyrannical king, vaunted their island institutions, and lauded the system of local Gothorths, yearly elections, yearly assemblies at Thingvellir, of their unwieldy and ineffective Althing, and the complex, lengthy, laborious, and fruitless procedure of their fatuous courts. Local pride seemed a passion which blinded them to the most glaring imperfections of anything Icelandic. 4. But it mattered very little what was the subject or the nature of the conversation. Thurkel found himself more than contented with any length of time which he might spend with either Thorarna or Thordis. Yet after not many days he was aware of a difference in his feelings for the two, and of theirs for him. Thordis never avoided him, but never put herself in his way. If everything was favorable and they happened to be thrown together accidentally, she frankly enjoyed being with him, but never did anything to prolong a chat or to bring one about. Thorarna, on the contrary, was most ingenious in postponing the termination of a colloquy, and was most fertile in clever, adroit, and unobtrusive devices, which resulted in their being together. Before many days' life at Hofstadter for Thorkel consisted chiefly of endeavoring to be with Thordis. Once, when he was basking in her smiles, her face suddenly clouded, and she said, "There, Thorarna has gone. Please try to spend more of your time with her, and less with me. From childhood she and I have been happy together, and nothing has ever blurred our love for each other, and our unreserved mutual confidence, until she began to grow jealous of me. Since she fell in love with you and we have become alienated, she is chilly to me, distant, reticent, even unfriendly. I grieve that we are estranged. I love her, and I want her to love me. I do not want her to hate me. Please do all you can to placate her. She keeps her countenance, and is always outwardly serene, sedate, and stately, but she rages inwardly, and is so infuriated when you talk to me that I dread her. Please avoid me and propitiate her all you can. Please promise me that you will do as I ask." Thorkel promised, and for some days barely greeted Thordis, and had no converse with her whatever, whereas he spent long hours with Thorarna, and to his amazement found that he enjoyed her society keenly, yet, even more to his amazement, felt that, when he was not with Thorarna, he longed for Thordis so acutely that he could hardly restrain himself from seeking her out, and telling her how much he loved her. The long spell of clear, mild weather merged into weather decidedly warm, weather which would have been warm even for Scotland or England. Thorstein, with a large retinue of spearmen, rode out to visit and inspect the outlying fringe of farms tenanted by his dependents or thingmen. It was a very fair day, and they had expected an easy jaunt and an early return to Hofstadter. So it turned out for Thorstein and most of his company. But early in the day they heard a report, hardly more than a rumor, of distress at a farmstead isolated among uplands at the extreme southwestern point of Thorstein's Gothorth, very much out of their way. Thorbrand offered to ride there and investigate, and Thorkel volunteered to go with him. He demurred to his father's suggestion that he take some of the men-at-arms, declaring that he and Thorkel could make better time alone. Off they set. Their errand was easily accomplished, and the rumor found untrue and everyone safe and well at Mossfell. But on their return they encountered conditions peculiar to Iceland. There it frequently happens during a prolonged spell of warm weather that great quantities of snow are melted high up on the plateaus or in hollows among the upper foothills, and very occasionally that the waters are dammed back by ice accumulated in some valley, ravine, gorge, or glen, and, if the hot weather lasts on, are suddenly released by the crumbling of the ice dam. Such a sudden and terrific freshet roared across their homeward way and presented a torrent of deep water, not only unfordable, but impossible to swim. They were perforce compelled to await the ebbing of the transitory flood, and so did not reach Hofstadter until the gradual twilight, insensible gloaming, and lingering dusk had melted into semi-darkness. Thorbrand, sedulously careful of their wary mounts, bade Thorkel go at once into the hall. Between the stable and mansion, out of sight of either behind the storehouse, he encountered Thordis. She burst into tears, crying, "Oh, my love, my love! Ref and Carly rode in after sunset on lathered horses, reporting that you and Thorbrand had been ambushed and killed. Oh, my love, my love!" Thorkel caught her in his arms, and they clung together, she sobbing, her head on his breast, he with one arm about her, his other hand stroking her hair, whispering, "My darling, my darling!" Suddenly her arms relaxed. She pulled away from him, pushed him from her, and cried in a strangled whisper, "Let me go! Thorarna might see us. Be careful. Thorarna must not see us together. Let me go. Avoid me. Keep away from me. Hardly speak to me. She must not see us together. Let me go." And she sprang away and vanished like a frightened hare. The weather for 2 days afterwards was not merely warm, but hot, weather which would have been hot anywhere, an occurrence very unusual for Iceland, but not unknown, especially on the east coast. On account of the heat, the fire in the hall was allowed to go out entirely, and at the evening meal 2 of the benches of the men-at-arms were set across the fireplace, close against the stonework of the chimney-piece. During these 2 days Thorkel spent as much time with Thorarna as he could manage, and found her fascinating, but moody, high-strung, and capricious. He sedulously avoided Thordis. Only for one moment did they have an opportunity to exchange a few words. Then Thordis, on the verge of tears and gasping, said, "Oh, I am so afraid of Thorarna. I don't know what I dread, but I am in the most fearful dread of her.
She is very suspicious of you. I think she conjectures that you and I love each other. You are too distant with her for her peace of mind. Thorarna, like all her mother's family, is petulant, choleric, touchy, irascible, hot-tempered, acrimonious, vindictive, impulsive, precipitate, and hot-headed. Oh, I am so afraid of her."
Thurkel tried to calm her, but could not. Early the third morning, just after dawn had brightened into day, the lookouts gave the alarm. And then, too late. For when the garrison of Hofstadr had barely armed and were not yet all at their posts, there fell upon them 3 simultaneous and perfectly coordinated assaults. From the west, along the strand, from the south down the slope, and from the north, from across the fjord by a party which had made an unopposed landing on the shore. Thurkel was among the defenders of the western side of the enclosure, and despite the hard fight he and his companions put up, their assailants succeeded in crossing the trench and scaling the wall. But thereupon they were beaten back by a desperate rally of the denizens, in which Thurkel played more than his part, for he, single-handed, successively slew 5 formidable antagonists. As their foeman wavered, he sprang at a 6th, parried his thrust, and got home in a deadly stroke on his helmet. The sword snapped. As his adversary was half stunned and wholly dazed by the force of the blow, Thurkel whirled about and made a dash for the hall. There he leapt upon one of the benches set across the fireplace, seized the hilt of one of the 6 identical swords, wrenched it from its fastenings, and waving it, dashed out. As he cleared the doorway, he heard elated shouts and an exultant cheer. Glancing to his right, he saw men in chainmail hauberks vaulting the eastern wall of the enclosure. He recognized in the lead Lodbrok and Halfdan, the chiefs, Gelir, Sigurd, and Bodvar, his treacherous friends, and others from the crew of the Sea Raven. He instantly divined that they had blundered into Mjolfifjord, or Sedisfjord, had fraternized with the Sedisfjorders and Mjolfifjorders, and had readily agreed for their share in the prospective loot, to take part in capturing and sacking the richest homestead in eastern Iceland. On fire with his chance of revenge, he flew at Lodbrok, and as he charged, it seemed to him that never had he run so swiftly. Never had he felt so strong, so capable, so eager for a fray, so sure of success. He beat back Lodbrok's guard and swung a full arm sweep of his blade at his head. The sword went up like a feather and came down like a battle-axe. As if through cheese, it clove helm, skull, jaw, and chin down into the breastbone. Lodbrok fell like a pole-axed ox, and as Thurkel saw him go down, almost in 2 halves, he realized that he was wielding Floki's blade. He whirled on Gelir, and the sweep of the sword cut clean through not only both forearms between wrist and elbow, but also through the stout ash shaft of the pike he wielded. Behind Gelir was Halfdan, no mean adversary, truculent, wary, and skilled. He held his bright round, arabesqued shield close against his left shoulder, and lunged cunningly and viciously. Barely parrying his thrust, Thurkel swung his great sword, and lo, it shore clean through shield, gorget, hauberk, shoulder, and arm, so that his left forequarter fell clear of Halfdan, and he was dead before he crumpled on the earth. Similarly, Thurkel slew Bodvar, Sigurd, and Hrodmar. 2 the sharp sword beheaded at a single sweep. 1 it cleft under the sword arm, through his ribs, into his liver. Of the 4th, its point pierced his heart through shield and hauberk. Instinct made Thurkel spin round, and he faced Kolgrim Erlindsson, leader of the Vikings, and most redoubtable of them all. Their swords clashed, and Kolgrim's failed, snapped before the hilt, so that Thurkel's blade shore off his right shoulder, slicing through the rings of his chainmail hauberk, as if it had been of hemp, and he died as his fellow chieftain Halfdan Ingolfsson had died. Although their chiefs were all dead, the Vikings, descrying but one defender before them, were swarming over the wall. Among them Thurkel dashed, and at each stroke of Floki's blade a foeman died. Yet Thurkel must have been overwhelmed by mere numbers, if some of the Vilgerdsons and their men-at-arms, now victorious to north and south, had not flocked to his aid, amazed to see that Hofstadr had been saved by his unaided valor, and spurred on by admiration of him. Thurkel at their head, they drove the survivors of the Sea Raven's crew in headlong flight across the wall and trench, and Thurkel beheld in the distance the thralls of Erp, Ulf, Hundi, Kep, Sukolf, and Vifil, standing ready with spare shields, spears, bows, and quivers,
cast away their burdens, and turn in flight before the foremost of the fleeing Vikings reached them. The fight was over. The assailants were everywhere, beaten and routed. Thorstein forbade pursuit on foot, and only some 20 of the men-at-arms found horses ready, mounted, and sped out of the main gateway of the enclosure to complete the rout of the assailants, who left more than 40 corpses behind them. Of the victors, 12 spearmen had fallen, and with them 7 of Thorstein's dependent yeomen, 4 of his thingmen, and 2 cousins, Thorberg Vilgerdsson of Snowfell, and Thorid Vilgerdsson of Gelsbank. Thorkel, Thorstein himself, and Thorfinn were the only unwounded warriors among the defenders. All the rest of the family, all the cousins, thingmen, yeomen, and men-at-arms had suffered 1 or more wounds. But of the family only Thord was wounded seriously. His wounds were at once bound up and the blood staunched. Then, with one accord, every warrior of them all acclaimed Thorkel as their savior. They cheered him and saluted him as hero. Thorfinn and Thorgir seized him by the elbows, and following their father and following by the cheering throng, marched him into the great hall and up to the high seat. There Thorstein stood aside and motioned Thorkel to mount the dais and occupy the high seat. Before his dazed astonishment could protest, Thorfinn and Thorgir had gently forced him into it. There he sat, Floki's blade still red, point down between his knees, his hands crossed on the pommel of the upright hilt. Thorstein shouted,
"Mead for the hero! Not a man of us shall touch horn or bowl to lip until the hero has had his fill of my best mead. Mead for the hero!"
At the call, Thorarna appeared from the kitchen through the rear doorway, carrying with both hands a great bowl high before her. Down the hall she came, her face lit with a triumphant smile, magnificent and stately. Before the high seat she knelt and offered the bowl to Thorkel. The fighters cheered again. As Thorarna held up the bowl, Thorkel, to his horror, felt his right hand grasp the sword hilt with a grip he could not loosen, felt the sword raise itself and his arm till the blade swung high above the Thorarna, felt the magic of the sword drag down his arm in a deadly sweep, felt and saw the blow descend, felt and saw the blade shear through Thorarna's left shoulder, shoulder blade, collarbone, and ribs, cleaving her to the very heart. She crumpled in a horrid welter of spilt mead, gushing blood, disordered raiment, and huddled flesh. The onlookers stood, frozen mute. Into the hall rushed Thuridus and Thurgerd, screaming, "Do not drink! The mead is poisoned! Do not drink! The mead is poisoned!" At sight of the high seat, Thurkel on it, and what lay before him, Thuridus collapsed in a faint. Thurgerd was at once absorbed in tending her cousin. Thorstein shouted for his thralls.
"Ref, Carly, Mar, Odd, remove that carrion, cleanse the dais."
And when his orders had been obeyed and the dais and hall were again seemly, he called once more,
"Mead for the hero!"
Thuridus, now restored, though tottering, her golden-haired, pink-cheeked, blue-eyed loveliness, amazing even in her confusion, herself carried to Thorkel a horn. He took it, quaffed it, as he sat and handed it back to her. Then Thorstein shouted,
"Mead for all of us, and more mead for the hero!"
Maid servants flocked in with bowls, horns, and goblets, and behind them thralls with pails of mead to replenish those drained. All drank. Thorkel, too. A second horn offered him by Thuridus. From her knees he raised her and made her stand beside the high seat. Then Thorstein shouted, "Hail the hero!" Whereupon all the warriors cheered Thorkel until they were hoarse. Into the ensuing silence, Thorstein spoke clearly and gravely.
"Tomorrow we shall revel in honor of our deliverance, victory, and safety. And the banquet shall be the wedding feast of my niece, Thordis, and of her bridegroom, my cousin, Thorkel Vilgerdsson of Rogaland in Norway, our hero."
End of Section 2. Floki's Blade.